Olá a todos, hello everyone. Eu sou a professora Mariana Kalil, da Escola Superior de Guerra, e você, a chair, vou coordenar a mesa de hoje. This is Mariana Kalil from the Brazilian War College. I'll be chairing this roundtable today. Essa roundtable, essa mesa, vai acontecer em inglês, e a gente vai receber as perguntas nos comentários do YouTube, tanto em inglês quanto em português. Se forem feitas em português, eu traduzo para o inglês, sem problemas, e eles responderão em inglês. So, to begin our conference, I'm going to read Professor Matt's and Professor Joseph's bios, so that you probably know them, you probably Google them if you don't know them, but you probably know them. If you're here, you know them, but I'll read it anyway. So Matt Hardy is Senior Lecturer in Middle East Studies at the Faculty of Arts and Education of the Deakin University, Australia. He's an affiliate of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, the Open and Distance Learning Association of Australia, and the Australian Middle East Research Forum. He's interested and has researched in the following areas: use of Orientalism in depiction of Eastern cultures in fantasy worlds, transition of power in Libya, armed intervention in the Middle East, peacekeeping and the use of force, media depiction of the Middle East and violence, and deployment of e-learning and collaborative online tools in political science studies. He has written papers and chapters on these research topics and education. Welcome, Professor Hardy. So I'll read Professor Joseph's bio, and then I'll pass the word for Professor Matt Hardy. Professor Joseph Kocho is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at the University of Dschang, Cameroon. He coordinates the Political, Strategic, and Social Research Unit in this university. He's interested in governance issues, local governance, forestry governance, and recently collected a book on forest governance in Central Africa. He also works on the issue of policy transfers in Africa and directs his thinking on the counterterrorism policy transfers in Africa. So each of them is going to have 20 minutes to speak, and then we go on to Q&A that you can ask in Portuguese or English. And if you ask in Portuguese, I'll translate to them to English. Okay, thank you. Professor Matt, it's with you.
It's with me. So I'm hoping somebody's going to bring my slides up at some point. But, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. It's pretty late at night here. It's just after midnight. So if I sound a little bit sleepy, that's for that reason. I'm going to talk to you about the legacy of 9/11 in Australia. And I guess Australia is not something you commonly think of when it comes to 9/11, but the attacks in America did have some quite significant repercussions in terms of Australia's international relations, and also even probably greater impacts on its domestic politics. Now, in the attacks, 10 Australians were killed on that day of 9/11. 9 of them were killed in the New York World Trade Center attacks, and 1 was on the plane that was crashed into the Pentagon. What was significant for Australia right at that moment, though, was that our Prime Minister happened to actually be in Washington, D.C. on a state visit. So it was happening around him, and it brought it home to Australians and gave a very personal angle that was covered live, because he was actually speaking to the Australian media at the time when the attack occurred on the Pentagon. Now, there are 2 great legacies of the 9/11 attacks on Australia, and I'm going to talk through them in different slides. The first big legacy is an international relations outcome. And if I was to summarize what that outcome was, it would be all the way with the USA. Because what these attacks and their aftermath did was cement Australia ever more firmly to the US alliance. Now, we were already, of course, closely allied to America, but these attacks and the conservative government that we had at the time really made that bond very much stronger. And that saw Australia participate militarily in the invasions of Afghanistan, which of course many other coalition members did as well. But it also saw Australia as one of only 3 other nations besides the United States that committed combat troops to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And of course, that invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a much more contested commitment, and one that saw Australia's reputation internationally very much coloured in the same way as G.W. Bush's America. The commitment to America and the war on terror on the part of Australia also manifested in terror attacks being carried out against Australians, both at home in Australia and overseas. And the most significant of these was the bombings that were carried out in Bali, Indonesia in 2002, and again on a smaller scale in 2005. And I will detail those because you may not be that familiar with them. Then, with the rise of the Islamic State in 2014 and beyond, Australian sympathisers of this ideology also carried out attacks within Australia, as well as some citizens travelling off to fight in Syria and Iraq with Islamic State and its affiliates. That's the big international picture. The second legacy of 9/11 in Australia is on domestic politics. And this saw a great tightening of security laws in Australia, with much greater increases in surveillance, increased police powers of detention, and a lot of laws controlling media reporting of terrorism as well. And a further expression of this, I guess, this culture of fear that was fostered about terrorism was an increasing xenophobia about foreigners and asylum seekers. And of course, in particular, Muslim people who were trying to come to Australia. And this led the government, with the support of the public, to some very harsh approaches on asylum seekers, including a program of detaining asylum seekers offshore in third-party countries, where Australia paid smaller Pacific Island neighbours to house people whose refugee claims were being assessed. And they were often held offshore in these detention centres for years at a time. I'll quickly move through some of those factors going through in the next few slides. So if I could have the slide moved one forward, please. Thank you. I just thought I'd put it into numbers here. Here is Australia's commitment to the invasion of Iraq. There you go. USA, UK, Australia, and Poland. And, you know, with that commitment, thank God we were there. I don't know that it necessarily tipped the balance. The invasion of Iraq in alliance with America was sold to the Australian public in the same way that it was sold to the American people. The idea of weapons of mass destruction and that allegation that Saddam Hussein had supported al-Qaeda. And it was also sold to the Australian public as an important alliance building strategy with America. And this idea of bonding ourselves to America was very key to Australia's middle power ambitions and status, particularly in the Asia Pacific. You know, how much total impact did 2,000 Australian personnel make on the course of the invasion in 2003? Probably not a lot, because most of those 2,000 troops were actually naval personnel. So they were sitting on ships in the Persian Gulf. So we didn't make a massive contribution in terms of military power, but the contribution was in terms of political impact. It was, of course, really important for America to have another partner on board with this military invasion of Iraq. And of course, that satisfied that important strategic alliance for Australia. That made, I guess, a huge contribution to our middle power ambitions, much greater than the weight of the actual personnel that were committed. And of course, Australia returned to Iraq and Syria in 2014 when the Islamic State were on the rampage through the country. And so we committed mainly Air Force assets to that fight against Islamic State. I guess both of these commitments kept that post 9/11 use of terrorism as a fear factor that came up a lot in domestic politics. And there was this idea that, you know, fighting against terrorism militarily and ideologically was a worthwhile cause, and it was sold very hard like that by successive Australian governments. Next slide, please. So whilst Australia only lost those 10 people in the actual September 11 attacks, it was the bombings in Bali in 2002 that was kind of our own 9/11. Now, that Indonesian island of Bali is a very common tourist destination for Australians. And the place is very set up to cater for Australian tourists, of particularly young tourists. I don't know what the equivalent in Brazil might be, but it's very much a beach and party destination for young Australians and Australian families. It often involves, large crowds. The security tends to be very lax. And of course, it became a target for Islamic militants from Indonesia. And there was a bombing, or a couple of different bombs, in October 2002. And those bombing attacks killed 202 people. And 88 of those people were Australian. So much, much greater impact than the actual 9/11 attacks in terms of Australian casualties. And that attack, and you can see some of the newspaper headlines there from the time, that attack further stiffened Australia's commitment to the war on terror. And it made it much easier for the Australian government to create that fear among Australians that we were constantly under threat. And, there were bad people from overseas, and indeed bad people in our own community that hated us. And there was another smaller attack on Bali in 2005, and that killed another 4 Australians. And this kept that idea of Australia being under threat from terrorism very much in the public mind. Next slide, please. When the Islamic State began to, I guess, become famous in sort of 2013, 2014, sympathisers in Australia carried out different attacks here as well. And now probably the most famous of these was the Lint cafe siege in December 2014. And this was where a fairly mentally disturbed individual took over a cafe that was right in the very, very centre of Sydney, and a hostage siege ensued. It also happened to be right across the road from the studios of a major commercial television network who were covering it live. Now, initially, there was no connection to terrorism. But as the negotiations went on over several hours, the gunman, the guy who'd taken the hostages, demanded an Islamic State flag as part of his negotiations. He didn't have one with him when he went in. And there were unsuccessful attempts made within the Sydney Islamic community to find such a flag, but nobody actually had one. But the police managed to source an approximation of an Islamic State flag, and that was given to the guy who was holding the hostages, and it was held up against the window by the hostages. And that really changed this story from what was really a local crime story into major international news at a time when Islamic State was just becoming famous. And, what would ordinarily have just been a fairly local story became an international one. Now, after that event, there were a few attacks by lone men with knives and vehicles around Australia. Though like this first one, they were generally carried out by quite mentally ill individuals who sometimes, just invoked the idea of the Islamic State as a way of gaining attention or publicity for what they were doing. But it led to a real hysteria in Australia, and a situation where every time there was even a kind of major traffic accident or something in the middle of the city, the police had to immediately clarify that terrorism was not a factor. This was not an Islamic State attack, but everybody was looking over their shoulders all the time as to what the next one would be. Next slide, please. To piggyback on that domestic concern about terrorism, Australia began to enact a series of laws to deal with it. The big one was the Australian Anti-Terrorism Act of 2005, and that set the baseline, and a lot of other things were added onto that. Now, to put it into perspective, Australia has enacted over 80 anti-terrorism laws since 9/11. And at the moment, we get a new or amended anti-terror law about every 7 weeks. And the grip is gradually tightening on data, on journalism and privacy. The 2005 Anti-Terrorism Act was primarily concerned with control orders, preventative detention of suspects of terrorism. It was really important in Australian law because it was a big erosion of some key aspects of our criminal laws. Because in a sense, with this act, it meant that people who were arrested on terrorism charges could be held until they were proven innocent. So not the other way around. The presumption of innocence was gone in this anti-terror legislation, and you were guilty until you were proven innocent. And this did happen in a couple of spectacular cases in Australia where people were detained and held for weeks at a time, long after it became apparent that they had no real connection to terrorism. This act also meant that periods of detention could be extended and shortcut certain judicial processes. There were also restrictions on reporting about what was going on with terror suspects. It also made things like reckless funding a criminal offence. That meant that providing money when that it might be used for terrorism became an offence. You could donate to a charity, and if that charity ultimately became involved in a terrorist attack, then you could be imprisoned as well for your monetary donation, even if you had no idea where it was going. We created this sort of, there was this idea that, you don't have anything to fear about these laws if you're not doing anything wrong. So that was that typical excuse. Why are you concerned that the government wants to monitor your emails or your phone calls? If you've got nothing to hide, you don't have anything to worry about. Australia has now become one of the most surveyed and least private nations in the Western world. And this is a direct legacy of 9/11. There was a very xenophobic approach to asylum seekers that's been part of this legacy as well, and pretty well stoked by the Murdoch press, a fear that Muslims were coming to Australia in disguise as asylum seekers, or terrorists were coming disguised as asylum seekers. That created some very strong laws against asylum seekers in Australia. It became very unpalatable for governments of any stripe to have refugees land in Australia unless they were pre-approved. And that fear that they were coming here and were going to carry out nefarious acts was very strong. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that we actually, the Australian governments were paying smaller Pacific neighbours such as Papua New Guinea or Nauru to house people in camps so that these people could not set foot on Australian soil. And it's a really, black mark in Australia's human rights record, definitely the way these people have been treated. Some of these people were in these detention centres for 7 or 8 years or more, and then ultimately never settled in Australia, were turned around or sent off to third-party countries. Last slide. So that briefly is the legacy of 9/11 in my country. One of fear, one of surveillance, and one of, looking at foreigners as potential threats. A study done by the Australian National University in 2016 found that 45% of Australians were concerned that they or a family member could become the victim of a future terrorist attack. And 71% of those respondents were either concerned or very concerned about the rise of Islamic extremism in Australia. And another poll in 2016 found 49% of Australians supported a ban on Muslim immigration. So that's a fairly strong outcome. But in Australia, on our own soil, only 6 people have died as victims of terrorism, plus 5 of the perpetrators of those attacks. As I said, some of those were a bit indeterminate about whether they really were terrorist motivated. But anyway, at best, 11 terrorist-related deaths on Australian soil in 20 years. But year in and year out, one woman a week is murdered in Australia at the hands of a current or former partner. Far greater scale of death than terrorism. So I think the legacy in Australia of 9/11 is that the true power of terrorism is to terrify, and to terrify us into believing things are bad, to terrify us into believing that people are evil and people who are different from us are a threat. And it's also a way of distracting ourselves from the things that are actually really wrong in our own society and do need fixing. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. Very eye-opening, a lot of food for thought, Professor. Now we're gonna welcome Professor Joseph to talk about Cameroon and Africa. Please, Professor, with you.
Thank you. Thank you for handing me the floor. I will discuss the aftermath of September 11 attack in Africa, not only in Cameroon. What we need to know at the beginning of my presentation is that the Al-Qaeda attacks not only reshaped the US, but also the international security policy. And the attack also had a very great impact in Africa. Although many countries had experienced terrorism before 9/11, we can say that the prevention of terrorism became a distinguishable phenomenon after 9/11 in Africa. So in my presentation, I would like to indicate that there is an enduring legacy of September 11 in Africa. And to do such, I will focus my word around 2 points. I will first focus on the immediate effect of that September 11 attack that happened in one country. I will then focus on the long-term effects of this event in Africa. Now, let's start with the immediate aftermath of the September 11 attacks. I will say that there is an engagement against terrorism, but an engagement challenged by divergent interests in Africa. And I will take into consideration the reaction of the different African leaders, because one of the immediate effects of that attack were the reaction of political leaders all over the continent, African continent. And for do such, I will borrow from the essay written by Albert Ishman. The essay is entitled Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. I will use that trilogy to posit 3 kinds of behavior of African leaders when engaging themselves in the analysis of those attacks. I will first start with loyalty. We realized that immediately after the attack, there was a loyalty to the engagement against terrorism in Africa. What we need to know is that counter-terrorism loyalty is the fact that the leaders are relying on the consecration of counter-terrorism as a standard of international relations. That is to say that all the politics, all the policies, security policies put in place were very influenced by the counter-terrorism loyalty. This implies the normative orientation of the Organization of African States in the direction of counter-terrorism. at the initiative, after the attacks, at the initiative of Abdoulaye Wade, then president of Senegal, the representative of 28 African countries, including 10 head of state, adopted in October 2001 in Dakar, Senegal, a declaration against terrorism. And they were calling for the holding of an extraordinary summit of the Organization of African Unity. And in July 2004, the protocol to African Union Convention on the Prevention and Combating to Terrorism was adopted in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Now, loyalty to the engagement against terrorism, we can also mention voice and exit options against the fight. These options were particularly found in Islamic structure established in Africa, particularly in Nigeria, Sudan, and the Maghreb country. In this organization, the argument was very simple. The fight against terrorism, launched by the United States, was seen as turning into the fight against Islam. But the protest demonstration organized by some of these associations were rendered inaudible by the loud noises made by supporters of the fight against terrorism in Africa. But like I said before, the observation of the reality lead to enrich the three options proposed by each mind by integrating the simulation option, because there was a simulation option by many heads of state in Africa. When I say simulation option, I want to raise up cosmetic reforms made by many heads of state in order to convince the international community of their engagement against terrorism. I mean, Africa's involvement in the global war on terror was at the 2001 Anti-Terrorism Summit in Dakar, directed to prevent a new wave of attacks from harming the continent's development. This was more of a political statement to encourage international partners to continue supporting Africa. Initially, it worked as the US and European government repackaged their aid to countries supporting the anti-terror campaign. US foreign assistance to Africa was used as an incentive to reward its allies. The unintended consequences of these incentivized counter-terrorism efforts in Africa is that they helped found authoritarian regimes. The United States and European countries have turned a blind eye to human rights abuses that seriously undermine democracy and good governance in Africa. In fact, many regimes solicited for counterterrorism by external powers take advantage of this to consolidate their power through repressive measures. Violation of freedoms and human rights by the armed forces are recurrent in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, countries that have benefited the most from the financial assistance from the United States in the fight against terrorism between 2014. But we also have, apart from the immediate legacy of the World Trade Center event in Africa, we also have the current legacy. Two main current legacy. The first one is that Africa is now on the global jihad agenda. But symmetrically, Africa is also in the global agenda for the fight against terrorism. Let us discuss the global jihad agenda. Let me be clear. I'm not saying that before the attack of September 11, Africa was a land free from terrorism. No one has forgotten the terrorist attack of August 1998 against the American embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Nairobi. No one has either forgotten the attack perpetrated in Algeria between 1992 and 1999 by the Islamic Salvation Army. What I want to highlight is the fact that after 9/11 event, Africa became a breeding ground for terrorists. In Africa, Al-Qaeda became a label, the label of loathing and vulnerability has American hegemony. Al-Qaeda has been emulated in Africa, and many terrorist groups, hitherto timorous, have found themselves emboldened by the events of September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda has become, for many groups, a model of presence and action in international relations. Even in Africa public opinion, it is not uncommon to see Al-Qaeda set up as a model, the model of the deconstruction of Western hegemony that affects Africa. Since that date, the unprecedented jihadist breakthrough has undermined state security apparatus in Africa. The emergence in Africa of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Al-Murabitun, Ansar al-Sharia, and other jihadist groups can be seen as the consequence of the erection of Al-Qaeda and bin Laden in golden calves of resistance against Western liberalism. Using satellite structures, the Islamic State, for example, has expanded into all 5 geopolitical regions of Africa. In Africa, Islamists carried out numerous high-profile strikes in 2002 and 2003 in countries including Tunisia, Kenya, Egypt, Algeria, and Morocco. In Nigeria, the Nigeria Taliban was founded in 2002 in the northeastern state of Borno. That group later became Boko Haram. That group is causing almost every day a lot of trouble in Nigeria and in neighbor countries like Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, my country. I'm belonging, as I said in my presentation, I'm belonging to a research group devoted to the study of that Boko Haram terrorism in Cameroon. In the post-9/11 era, the Islamic State's emergence and the declaration of an Islamic Caliphate in 2014 revolutionized recruitment and participation in terrorism in Africa. Like Al-Qaeda, and empowers local group or affiliated. Satellite structure called wilayat or provinces have enabled Islamic State to expand its reach into all Africa. When I say geopolitical, the 5 geopolitical region, I mentioned Lake Chad Basin, the Sahel, the Maghreb, and the Horn of Africa, and Mozambique Democratic Republic. Attacks are mainly carried out by local affiliates supported by Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. With the attack of Boko Haram in Cameroon, terrorism entered the daily life of the population. Strict security measures are now introduced in all types of domestic transport. It is now impossible to embark on a trip without a little fear of possible attacks that one could suffer. If Africa entered the global jihad agenda, it symmetrically entered the global agenda for the fight against terrorism. The fight against terrorism has become a global priority to eliminate the threat posed by extremists and their financiers. Many international actors have took the decision to confront terrorism in the African soil. After the terrorist event of September 11, the United Nations Security Council, acting under the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, unanimously passed the resolution 1373. The resolution directed that the UN member state introduce a separate crime of terrorism into their national laws. Flowing from the UN resolution framework, almost all the African states created new counter-terror laws and sophisticated secret surveillance programs. These laws and secret surveillance programs have generated criticism and many judicial challenges, but that is not the point for now. The decision by the Pentagon to create a separate African command is the clearest indication that the US military and other branches of the US government view sub-Saharan Africa threat. US officials see the African continent as an increasingly important front in the global war on terror. Washington is particularly focused on the North Africa and East Africa, including the Horn, for two reasons: their geographic, cultural, and religious proximity to the Middle East, and the fact that these regions constitute fertile ground for the development of other anti-American terrorist action. Currently, as we are discussing, US Special Operation Forces are training armies in Mali, Niger, Mauritania, and Chad under authority of the Department of State Pan-Sahel Initiative. The former Britain Prime Minister Tony Blair also engaged his country in the fight against terrorism in Africa, describing Africa as a scar on the conscience of the world. Many Britain soldiers were sent in Africa in order to train armies against terrorists. France also launched the Operation Barkhane, a regional counter-terrorism military operation in the Sahel in order to confront many terrorist groups acting in Guinea, Mali, and Niger. Even the European Union is also active in security assistance. It provides the J5 Sahel Joint Force, which fights terrorism and organized crime in the Sahel with its largest funding. The European Union also has 3 security forces training missions, 1 in Niger and 2 in Mali. The military mission in Mali also advises and trains the troops of the joint force. To conclude, what can we say about the legacy of September 11 in Africa? We can only say that Africa was invited without his will in the terrorism issue. Africa is now one of the most important fields of the fight against terrorism in the world. Thanks for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor. Very enlightening. A lot of information. So I'm going to invite Matt back, and I'm going to begin asking questions from the audience. And I have questions myself. I think the first question from the audience has been answered especially by Joseph, but I think Matt might want to weigh in on that. So it's like after 20 years have passed, how would you describe your countries as safe spaces, or do you still see latent threats to your security? I think you've both touched the issue, but how do you feel in the streets? And is it a matter of lenses, so political identity, and then if you identify with policies that are xenophobic, do you feel unsafe? Or if you don't feel that unsafe? How does it work in Australia? Please, the audio, Matt. It's off.
I think in Australia, the people would feel more safe than they did 4 or 5 years ago. But I can tell you that early next year, they're going to start feeling less safe. And that's because there's going to be an election in May. And the Conservative government tends to play up those fears of needing to be strong and, defending the country and defending our way of life. So I expect some media accumulation of fear early next year.
For sure. Please, Joseph, would you like to weigh in? I think you've covered it.
Yes. On that specific issue, I want to say that, for example, taking the example of my country, all the trips, all the travels in the countries are not safe because almost every travelers are moving with a kind of fear of bomb, fear of attack. But another legacy is that we have many regimes in Africa recycling laws, counter-terrorism laws, qualifying their opponent as terrorist. And when you are qualified as a terrorist, you know that you can be sentenced severely by laws. And all the government, many governments are using laws against terrorism in order to combat not only terrorists, but also their opponents.
Thank you. Yes, that's kind of what Roberto is asking, and I'm going to read his questions, but I'm going to weigh in as well. I'm going to take advantage of my position here because my question is connected to Roberto's question. And what I can see, it's basically a comment, but maybe what I can see that's happening in Australia and in Africa as well, with more layers in Africa, but also in Australia, is that there is an erosion of democracy because of the terrorist fear. And to a certain extent in Australia and pretty obviously in Africa. And what I would like to ask Matt is that I know it exists in Africa, but there's probably have been in Africa, there's been which would happen in Latin America as well, a militarization of government, of bureaucracies because of the terrorist threat. Do you see this happen in Australia as well, or you can still have like?
Look, I don't think there's a militarization in that true sense. I think the powers of our intelligence services have been expanded massively, and the removal of the need for them to need warrants to investigate something, for example. So we are not a militarized society in any way, but there is a deeper level of surveillance and legal framework that is going on. And Joseph mentioned about the use of anti-terrorism laws to discredit opponents. Now, we don't really have that in Australia in that political sense. It would not happen that an opposition leader would be rounded up on terrorism charges. But what does happen is this idea that somebody who is questioning the need for this surveillance or questioning all this security they are deemed un-Australian. And I don't know if we had the un-American activities back in the 50s, but in Australia, being called un-Australian is a very significant political baggage to hold. And there's this idea that if you're not supporting security, then you're un-Australian, then you're an opponent of freedom, perversely. So that's what we see a little bit of here politically.
Yeah, nationalism, nationalist wave. Yes. I'm going to go on to ask questions from the audience. The first one is by, do you want to weigh in, Joseph?
Yeah, from what Matt just said, there is a great difference between Africa and Australia, because in Africa, there is a kind of shift of terrorist group moving from the Middle East, mostly those from the Sahel region, are daily confronting terrorist groups. That is why here we are in hotspot territories. And hotspot territories are made by, regulated by many measures, laws, for example, severe laws concerning security. And that is why we are experiencing different situation from Australia.
For sure. I can relate, because if a similar thing happened in Brazil, we would have a democratic erosion, we would have militarization, we would see a very different scenario than Australia, for sure. But I'm going to go on and ask questions by Roberto. So he has two questions. One of them is for Matt, the other is for Joseph. I'm going to begin with the question for Matt then. Matt, do you consider that the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the aftermath have affected democracy and elections in Australia at some point?
Yeah, and I thank you for your question, Roberto. Yes, I do consider that it has affected the discussions around elections, and certainly for the last 14, 15 years, a lot of the discussion, a lot of the policy discussion in Australian elections has been about border security, and particularly that need to keep out people who are different from us, and particularly those asylum seekers who were arriving by boat. And this has been, some of our elections, some of our federal elections have really been fought on this issue, even though it's not much to do with most Australians' way of life. But which party is going to be tougher on asylum seekers? Which party is going to be tougher on border security? It definitely affects the dialogue, and it's exacerbated because we have a very limited number of media outlets in Australia, and many of them are controlled by the Murdoch and Fox conglomerates. So it's a very conservative dialogue that goes into elections here.
Great, thank you. So for Joseph, how do you, it's by Roberto, how do you assess the impact of the terrorist attacks on the political and economic destabilization of Africa?
I think politically, I mentioned the fact that there is a kind of opportunistic use of security laws against opponents by the ruling class in Africa, in some African states. I've also mentioned the fact that security issue is becoming one of the most important elements of the political agenda in Africa. I will also mention the fact that the ruling leaders in Africa have now the advantage engaging the army against terrorist groups. And by doing such, they are gaining in terms of legitimacy. Economically, we have big consequences. The main impact is the reduction of the circulation of people and goods in Africa. For example, there was a great economic road between West Africa and Central Africa, passing through Nigeria. But now, because of the Boko Haram issue, it is impossible to have those exchanges between Central African and West African countries. And all the states are losing a lot of money from that situation.
Thank you, Professor Joseph. And we've got one final question for Professor Joseph. It's by Tadeu Morato, one of our professors. He asks if you could talk a little bit about how 9/11 affected the participation and the reception of peacekeeping operations.
I beg your pardon, please.
It's if you could talk a little bit about how 9/11 affected the participation and reception of peacekeeping operations in African countries.
Let's say there's at that point that issue is very contentious in Africa. In many countries like mine, the public opinion is against Western countries, considered as the one in Africa. For example, France is considered as the one financing terrorism in Sahel region. In order to gain the region, that specific region rich in minerals, against China, against the other competitor. And that is why, in the public opinion, the interventions, humanitarian intervention, are not welcomed in African countries.
Thank you. Yeah, you brought the China layer. The China layer complexifies everything by a million, I think. And that was very interesting. Thank you, Professor Matt. Thank you, Professor Joseph. I think we can wrap it up. We don't have any more questions. I'd like to thank our audience and our professors. Professor Matt, it's late at night there. Please have a great night.
I'm going to bed.
Thank you, everyone. Obrigada a todos. Bom dia a todos. Obrigada. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, Matt.
Good night, Joseph. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.